Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Window Across the Hollow. When I first moved into the cabin, it was late autumn, the kind of weather where the air smells of cold wood smoke and leaves turn brittle enough to crumble in your hand. The hollow was quiet in a way I'd been craving. No traffic, no neighbors throwing loud parties, no glow of a city in the distance. Just the dark stretch of trees and the steady low sound of wind brushing over the ridge. The only other house in sight sat across the clearing from mine, maybe 200 yards away. It was small and square, its roof sloped too low, the porch sagging like a broken back. Both upstairs windows were black, and the paint on the siding had peeled so much that bare grey wood showed through. From the look of it, no one had been inside for years. The first week passed in the kind of peace I thought I'd come here for. I split firewood, patched a leak in the roof, made coffee that tasted like it belonged in a camp cup. But on the 5th night, while sitting at my little table and sorting through the last box of my things, I glanced out my own upstairs window and froze. There was movement across the hollow, in the dark shape of that other house. The left upstairs window had something in it, a pale oval that stood out against the black. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting, and realized it was a face. I don't know why my first instinct was to wave, but I did. I lifted my hand slowly, a little embarrassed. The figure didn't move, didn't wave back, just stayed there, still as if it had been carved into the darkness. After a long moment, I stepped back from my own window and told myself it was probably a trick of the moonlight, but when I looked again, the face was gone. Over the next several nights, I found myself glancing toward that window without meaning to. Sometimes the pale shape was there, sometimes not. The strangest thing was how the window's covering seemed to change. One night, the glass was bare. Another, the curtains were closed tight. Another night, I could see that someone had tacked newspaper over it from the inside, yellowed sheets pressed against the panes. By morning, the paper would be gone again. A week after I first saw it, I decided to stay up later than usual to see if I could catch whoever was in there moving around. I kept my own upstairs lamp on while I read, making sure my chair faced the window. Around 11, I happened to glance up and my chest tightened. There was someone in the yard across the hollow. They were standing dead still in the frost-glazed grass, facing my cabin. I couldn't see their features, but they were tall, maybe taller than me, their shape outlined faintly by the glow from my lamp. I watched them for several minutes, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I finally got up, went downstairs, and stepped out onto my porch. The air hit me sharp and cold. The clearing was empty. Whoever it was had slipped away without a sound. The next day, I stopped by the gas station about 15 minutes down the road. The man at the counter was the kind of old you can't quite guess. Thin, deeply lined face, eyes sharp even when his voice was slow. I asked him if anyone lived in the old house across from mine. He gave me a strange look and said, "Ain't been anyone in that place for 20 years. Not since the Harris boy went missing. I asked him what happened, but he just shook his head. "Some things ain't worth stirring up," he said, ringing me up for my coffee and bread. That night, I left my upstairs lamp off. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional snap of the wood stove. I didn't sleep. Just before dawn, I finally looked toward the tree line outside my window. And there it was, the figure again. This time, it wasn't in the yard across the hollow. It was on my side, standing just at the edge of the trees. The frost had turned the grass pale, and the figure's legs seemed to sink into it like they weren't solid. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was still half asleep, but I could feel the prickling along my neck that comes when you're being watched. I stayed in bed until the light grew strong enough to show me the clearing was empty. The next few days were quiet, but not in a way that brought any peace. I found myself drawing the curtains before dark, keeping the lamp turned low. I stopped going upstairs at night altogether, sleeping on the old couch by the wood stove instead. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the edge of the woods. It was the third night after that dawn sighting when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, not on the door but somewhere deeper in the cabin, like on the wall between the kitchen and the living room. I froze, listening. The knocks didn't repeat. When I worked up the courage to check, nothing was there, but the air in the kitchen felt colder than it should have. The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the frost near the porch steps were faint depressions, not quite footprints, but the grass was bent in a shape that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human, exactly. Too long, too narrow. That night, the upstairs lamp across the hollow was on. I could see into that window for the first time, and my stomach turned. The room inside was empty. No furniture, no curtains, just bare boards and dust. And yet, as I stared, that pale oval shape slid into view again, slow, as if it had been waiting for me to look. I didn't wave this time. I just stood there until my vision blurred, and when I blinked, the window was black again. I thought about going back to the gas station, about pressing that old man for more, but I never did. Some part of me felt that if I learned the truth, I'd never be able to leave. And now, even when I think about packing up and driving out, I wonder if it would follow me anyway. Some nights, I swear I hear footsteps in the frost outside, circling the cabin slow, deliberate. I don't open the curtains anymore. I keep the stove fed, the couch warm, and I wait for morning. The other night, though, I woke before dawn, heart pounding for no reason I could name. I lay there, listening to the wind slide over the ridge. Then, faintly, I heard the creak of wood, like a floorboard under weight. Upstairs. I still haven't gone up to check, and I'm not sure I ever will. Story 2. The Man Who Borrowed My Dog. It was late in October, the kind of night where the air feels heavy before the frost settles in, when my dog went missing. Boone was never the wandering type. I could let him out to roam, and he'd circle back within an hour, tail wagging, paws muddy. But that night, when I called for him from the porch, there was nothing, just the long, hollow echo of my voice, slipping into the trees. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and boots, and stepped off the porch. The woods around my place aren't dense, but at night they feel endless. My beam of light caught on wet leaves and bare branches, but no movement. I walked the slope behind the cabin, crossed the old fence line, and headed toward the creek, calling his name until my throat went raw. Around midnight, a fog came in, soft and low, muffling every sound but my own boots in the leaf litter. I searched until the sky began to pale and the cold burned my hands. When I finally stumbled back to the cabin, Boone was nowhere to be found. By mid-morning, I decided I'd drive into town and ask around. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when a knock came at the door. When I opened it, there stood a man I'd never seen before, holding Boone by the collar. The dog looked worn out, ears flat, tail low. The man was tall, wiry, with a long face, and eyes too deep set for the rest of his features. His smile was wide enough to look wrong, showing too many teeth. "Borrowed him for a bit," he said, like that explained everything. His voice was thin and slow, the kind you'd hear on the porch of a man who spent too many winters alone. I asked why. He didn't blink. I needed him to keep something away from my place. That made me pause. What something? He just kept grinning, the corners of his mouth holding steady like it hurt him to move them. "Ain't my place to tell." Before I could say more, he let go of Boone's collar and stepped back. Boone didn't run to me, he just trotted inside without looking up, straight to his bed in the corner. I thanked the man, but he'd already turned and was walking down my drive. His shoulders hunched like the cold had found its way inside him. The rest of the day, Boone slept hard. Wouldn't touch his food, wouldn't follow me out to the woodpile like he usually did. When dusk settled in, I opened the back door to let him out. He stepped forward, sniffed the air, and backed up with a low whine. That was the first time I'd ever seen him refuse to go outside. I shut the door, feeling an unease I couldn't quite name. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was sitting in the dark by the stove. The fire burned low, Boone pressed against my leg. That's when I heard it, something scraping along the porch railing. It wasn't fast, more like a slow drag, wood complaining under weight. I didn't move at first, just held Boone's collar. He was rigid, his head low, eyes fixed on the door. Then a sound followed, one that cut through me, a man's whisper. Soft, almost like a lullaby, but the words clear enough to make my stomach tighten. "Thank you for the loan." It wasn't the voice of the man who'd brought Boone back. This one was lower, with a grit in it, as if it came from deep in the chest. I sat frozen until the scraping stopped. When I finally stepped to the window, the porch was empty, the frost untouched except for a single smudge near the railing. The next morning, Boone wouldn't leave my side. He followed me from room to room, his ears twitching toward every creak. I didn't see my neighbor again, though I thought I caught sight of him once at the far end of the creek, standing still with his head tilted like he was listening for something far away. That night, I locked every door and window, but sometime after 2, Boone started growling, low at first, then deep enough that I felt it in my feet. I turned on the lamp and saw him staring at the front door. The growl cut off suddenly, replaced by that same faint whine he'd made before. The scraping returned, slower this time, like whoever it was knew I was listening. Then came the whisper, closer than before, right at the other side of the door. "I'll bring him back tomorrow." The rest of the night passed without sleep. I kept my hand on Boone's back, feeling him shiver. By dawn, the air smelled like wet stone and something faintly metallic. The next day, I drove the road that wound past my neighbor's property, but the place was quiet, too quiet. The windows were black, the yard overgrown, and I couldn't even see a path where anyone might have walked to my place. That evening, Boone went to the back door without prompting. He stood there for a long while, sniffing. Then he stepped back and looked at me, tail still, as if waiting for me to understand. I didn't let him out. I don't know if the man still lives out there, or if what I heard was even him. Some nights the scraping comes back, and the whisper follows. I've stopped listening to the words. I don't want to know what else it might ask for. Story 3. Lights in the Chicken Coop. It started with the quiet, not the natural kind you get at night, when the wind settles and the crickets pause between their songs, but a heavier kind, like something had pressed a hand down over the whole place. I'd been keeping chickens for 5 years on that patch of land, and I knew the sounds they made well enough to read their moods. There was always some noise from the coop, soft clucking, the scrape of feet in straw, the occasional rustle of feathers. But for 3 days straight, there was nothing. Every morning I'd step outside with my coffee, expecting that familiar racket, and instead I'd get a dead stillness that seemed to leak out into the yard. The hens were eating, I could see that from the feed levels, but they didn't make a sound. No scratching, no flapping, not even a cluck when I stepped inside to check. Just a dozen pairs of glassy eyes watching me in a way I didn't like. It was the 4th night when I saw the light. I'd been sitting by the wood stove reading when a faint flicker caught my eye through the kitchen window. It was coming from the coop, pale, irregular, like someone moving a lantern back and forth. My first thought was a fox. They'd been known to nose their way under the boards, and sometimes the reflection from their eyes could fool you into thinking there was a light. But this was too steady for that, too deliberate. I grabbed the shotgun from behind the door, slipped on my boots and stepped out into the yard. The night air bit sharp at my face, and the grass crackled with frost under my feet. The closer I got, the more I could hear, a low murmur, too soft to make out words, but steady enough to set my teeth on edge. I eased the latch up and swung the coop door open. The smell hit me first, stale straw and something coppery beneath it. Then I saw him. My neighbor's boy, Danny, maybe 16, is sitting cross-legged in the middle of the coop. His head was bent forward, his hands resting on his knees, and his lips were moving slow and steady. The light I'd seen was coming from a small flashlight lying on the straw beside him, aimed down toward a loose board on the floor. The beam lit the space between the boards just enough for me to see the dark shape of something moving underneath, something shifting against the dirt like it was trying to push up. "Danny," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't look up, just kept whispering, his breath catching now and then like he was fighting tears. I stepped inside, the hens parting around me without a sound, and put a hand on his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" He flinched but didn't meet my eyes. His whisper broke long enough for him to say, "It likes it when I talk to it." "What likes it?" I asked. "The thing in the dirt." His voice was flat, like he was stating a fact too obvious to explain. "It likes chicken blood." I tightened my grip on his shoulder and pulled him toward the door. He resisted at first, but once I got him to his feet, he shuffled along, still not looking at me. His eyes were wet, but there wasn't fear in them. It was something else, something that made me wish there was fear instead. I walked him back to the property line, told him to go home, and said I'd speak to his father in the morning. He nodded, but he didn't answer, just turned and walked into the dark without looking back. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps in the yard, and I kept thinking about that board in the co-op floor and what might have been shifting underneath it. At first light, I went back out with a crowbar, determined to pry the floor up and see for myself. But when I opened the door, the hens were huddled tight in the far corner, eyes wide, and the smell was stronger, wet dirt and something metallic. The board Danny had been kneeling over was fixed in place now, nailed down with fresh, bright nails. I hadn't done it. I went straight to my neighbor's house. His father, Ray, answered the door looking half awake, rubbing his eyes. When I asked if Danny was home, Ray frowned and said he hadn't seen him since last night. I told him what I'd found in the coop, and his face hardened. "That boy's been off lately," he muttered, mostly to himself, "talking in his sleep." Wandering at night, I asked if he wanted me to help look for him, but he just shook his head. If he comes back, he comes back. If he don't, well... He trailed off, eyes drifting toward the woods. 2 days later, Danny was still gone. The sheriff came around, asked a few questions, Walked the property but didn't find anything. Ray didn't seem surprised. He didn't hang up any flyers or organize a search party. He just went back to his routines, same as before. The coop stayed quiet. The hens didn't make a sound, even when I scattered fresh feed. I stopped collecting eggs after finding one with a hairline crack in it and a smear of something dark along the shell. I tried patching the floor around that board, but every morning I'd find the new boards loosened, as if something had pushed up from underneath during the night. A week after Danny disappeared, I woke to a noise that pulled me straight from sleep. A long, low scraping, like wood being dragged across dirt. I got up, pulled on my coat and stepped out onto the porch. The sound was coming from the coop. Boone, my dog, stood stiff beside me, his hackles up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I took the shotgun and walked out, my breath clouding in the cold. When I opened the coop door, the flashlight was back, lying on the floor, shining at that same loose board. I hadn't put it there. The beam lit up fresh scratches in the wood, deep enough to splinter. The hens were all pressed into the farthest corner, their feathers puffed, their eyes wide. I stepped closer, the smell of dirt and blood thick in the air, and listened. Something was moving underneath, slow, deliberate, like it was shifting its weight. Then came a sound that I still hear in my head, soft, steady whispering. Not words I could understand, but the rhythm of it was the same as Danny's voice that night. I backed away, keeping the shotgun up, and left the door wide open. By morning, the flashlight was gone, and the board was nailed down again with the same bright nails. I haven't kept chickens since. The coop sits empty at the edge of the yard, its door hanging open, straw rotting on the floor. Some nights, I see a faint light flicker inside, and I think about going to tear the whole thing down, but I never do. Boone won't go near it, and I've learned to keep my distance too. Whatever's under there, it's patient. It's been quiet for months now, but the hens were quiet before too, and sometimes, just before dawn, when the air is still and the frost is thick, I swear I can hear a whisper carry across the yard, low and steady, like someone praying under their breath. Story 4. The bench beside the creek. When I bought the cabin, the bench was already there, old and greyed with years of weather. It sat on the far side of the creek, right where the water slowed and widened before slipping into the trees. The boards were warped, and moss clung to the legs where they sank into the soft bank, but it was sturdy enough to sit on. My neighbour, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carrow, told me it had been there longer than she could remember. "It's where you go to talk to the ones you've lost," she said one afternoon, her voice carrying across the yard like she wasn't speaking just to me. I laughed softly, thinking she was being poetic. Out here, folks had their ways of talking about grief, and I figured that was all it was, just an old woman's habit of dressing up a memory in fancier words. I didn't think much about the bench until one evening near the end of summer. I was splitting wood in the yard when I caught movement by the creek. The light was fading, and the water was the color of steel, but I could make out Mrs. Carrow sitting on the bench, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She was nodding slowly, like someone listening to a long story. I couldn't hear a thing except the steady hiss of the creek. I called her name, not loud, but enough for her to hear. She turned to look at me, and I swear my breath caught. Her face wasn't angry exactly. It was something heavier, like I'd walked into a church and shouted during a funeral service. Her eyes held mine just long enough for me to feel a kind of shame I couldn't explain. Then she turned back toward the water and stayed that way until the light was gone. The next morning, I went down to the creek to look at the bench. The ground around it was damp with dew, but the boards were dry, as if they'd been out of the weather entirely. A few days passed, and I didn't see her again. Then, one night in early fall, I woke to a stillness so complete it felt wrong. No wind, no crickets, not even the usual groan of the old cabins settling. I got up to get a drink of water and happened to glance out the window. The bench was in my yard. It sat neatly under the big oak tree, straight and solid, like it had always been there. My first thought was that I'd been mistaken, that maybe there'd been two benches all along, but I knew better. The legs still had bits of moss clinging to them, and one board had the same long split running down the middle. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to nip at my skin, but the wood of the bench felt warm under my hand, like someone had just been sitting there. The next day, I walked to Mrs. Carrow's house. Her yard was overgrown, the shutters hanging crooked, and when I knocked, there was no answer. I tried the door, but it was locked. A neighbor told me she'd gone to stay with her sister in another county, but I never saw her leave. That night, I dreamed I was standing by the creek. Only it was darker than night, and the water was still, reflecting nothing. I could hear voices low and steady, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. When I woke, my mouth was dry, and my heart was beating too fast. Boone, my dog, was at the foot of the bed, staring at the window. A week passed. The bench stayed under the oak, though I never moved it. I stopped going to the creek. Every so often, just as I was falling asleep, I'd hear a faint murmur outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the leaves, but it was too rhythmic, like a conversation. Sometimes I could make out her voice, soft, slow, almost comforting, and then another voice would answer. That second voice wasn't quite right. It was low, not deep exactly, but strained, like it was being pulled up from someplace far beneath the earth. One night, the voices woke me. The moon was bright enough to throw shadows across the yard, and I could see the outline of the bench under the oak. Mrs. Carrow sat on one end, her hands folded in her lap. The other end was occupied by something I couldn't see clearly. Its outline seemed to shift, as though the air around it was bending. She turned her head slightly, not toward me, but in a way that made it clear she knew I was watching. The conversation didn't stop. I stood there at the window until the shadows lengthened and merged, and then the bench was empty. After that, I kept the curtains drawn at night. The voices still came, sometimes closer to the cabin, sometimes farther, but always in that same measured pace. I tried telling myself it was just the creek carrying sound in strange ways, but the creek was too far, and the night too still for that. One evening in late October, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, trying to ignore the sound of them talking just beyond the trees. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. Boone shifted at my feet, his ears twitching, and then he lifted his head and stared into the dark. I followed his gaze and saw the bench. It wasn't under the oak anymore. It was closer, maybe 15 feet from the porch steps. I went inside and locked the door. The talking stopped. The next morning, the bench was back under the oak, and the ground between it and the porch was damp, like something heavy had been dragged across it. That winter, snow fell early. The bench sat untouched, a drift building up along one side. I didn't hear the voices for weeks, and I started to think maybe whatever had been happening was over. Then, one night in January, I woke to the sound of the bench creaking, the wood shifting like someone had just sat down. I didn't look. I lay there in the dark, listening to the slow back and forth rhythm, and eventually I heard her voice again. She was closer than ever, maybe just outside the wall. The other voice answered, low and deliberate, and though I couldn't make out the words, the tone carried something that made my skin prickle. By morning, the snow around the bench was gone, the ground bare and wet, as though the cold had never touched it. Boone wouldn't go near it. When I tried, I felt something like a vibration in the wood under my hand, faint but steady, almost like a heartbeat. I've thought about burning it, dragging it into the woods, anything to be rid of it. But something in me hesitates. The way you might hesitate before speaking in a room where people are praying. Some nights, I still wake to her voice, and sometimes I hear that other voice answer in a tone that feels almost human, but not quite. I lie there and listen, and I don't go to the window anymore. Story 5. The house that smelled like rain. Even in the driest stretch of summer, when the ground cracked and the air shimmered with heat, my closest neighbor's house always smelled like wet earth. It was faint when you passed on the road, but strong enough to notice. Rich, damp, almost like the air in a cellar after a hard rain. Folks out here have quirks, and I didn't think much of it at first. He never let anyone inside, always claiming the place was too much of a mess, but I figured he was just private. He kept to himself, tall and narrow in the shoulders, with a long, slow way of talking that made every sentence sound like the end of a thought. We'd nod when we passed, maybe swap a word or two about the weather, but that was it. That summer, the heat was relentless. Creeks shrank to strings of water, grass burned brown, and dust clung to your skin. Even then, his yard stayed oddly green, soft underfoot, as if the soil held onto moisture no one else could find. I noticed it one evening when I stopped to check my fence line. There was a coolness that drifted from his property, carrying that same smell of wet dirt. One night in late July, a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the hills, and the lightning came in quick flashes, lighting up the yard in pale blue for a breath at a time. I was at my kitchen window when I saw him. He was hauling something large out into his backyard, wrapped tight in a tarp. The wind had the tarp pressed against the shape underneath, and I could make out the edges, long, narrow, bent, slightly in the middle. Lightning cracked again, brighter this time, and I saw it plain as day, feet, pale, bare feet sticking out from the bottom of the tarp. I stepped out onto my porch and called his name. He didn't look back, just kept moving, dragging that shape across the grass until he reached the far end of his yard. He stopped there, bent down for a long moment, then straightened and walked back toward his house, empty-handed. By the time I worked up the nerve to go closer, the rain had started in hard, and the wind drove it sideways into my face. His yard was dark, the windows shut tight, no movement anywhere. The next morning, I walked over under the pretense of borrowing a tool. His yard was empty, no sign of the tarp, no sign of anything heavy having been dragged. The grass where I'd seen him the night before was untouched, not even flattened, but the ground was wet, soaked through in a way that didn't match the rest of the hollow. We'd had some rain, sure, but not enough to explain the mud there. The smell of wet earth was stronger than I'd ever noticed, thick enough that it seemed to stick in the back of my throat. Weeks passed. I didn't see him much, though sometimes I'd spot him at the far end of his yard, standing still with his hands in his pockets, looking toward the tree line. Then, one evening, the smell drifted into my own house. I noticed it first in the hallway, faint but distinct. Wet, dirt, cool and heavy. It got stronger toward the front door. When I opened it, the air outside was still and dry, but on the porch there were muddy footprints. They weren't fresh enough to be wet, but the mud had dried in ridges thick enough to crumble when I touched them. They led from the yard to my front door, and when I stepped outside, I saw that they didn't come from the road or my driveway. They came from the woods. I followed them without thinking, moving down the slope behind my cabin toward the tree line. The farther I went, the stronger the smell got, until it felt like I was breathing through damp cloth. The footprints led into the shade of the trees, where the ground was soft and dark. It hadn't rained in over a week, but my boots sank slightly with each step. I lost the trail after a while, the mud blending into the forest floor, but the smell lingered. It was everywhere, heavy enough to make me stop and turn back. That night, I dreamed of the storm again, only this time, when the lightning flashed, I saw him closer. The tarp was gone, and the shape he was dragging was just a man, limp and pale, with his eyes open and his mouth full of dirt. I woke with my sheets damp, not from sweat, but from the faint scent of rain and soil clinging to them. I tried to keep to myself after that, but the smell started appearing more often. On the porch, near the shed, once even inside the kitchen. Boone, my dog, started growling at the floorboards, especially near the back door. One morning, I found a small clump of wet dirt on the mat, with something pale tangled in it that might have been a root. About a month later, I saw him again. It was just before dawn, the sky barely lightening, and I was walking to my truck when I caught movement in his yard. He was kneeling in the grass, his back to me, digging with his bare hands. I couldn't see what he was burying or unearthing, but the ground around him was black and slick, even though the rest of the yard was dry. He stopped suddenly, like he'd felt my eyes on him, and turned his head just enough to show me the side of his face. There was mud smeared across his cheek, and his lips were moving, though I couldn't hear the words. I didn't wave. I just got in my truck and drove into town, even though I had no reason to be there. When I came back that afternoon, his yard was empty again. The soil where he'd been digging smoothed over like nothing had happened. The last time I saw him was during another storm. I was sitting in my living room, the rain tapping hard against the roof, when I caught sight of him through the window. He was standing at the edge of my yard, soaked through, his clothes clinging to him. The smell of wet earth rolled in ahead of him, even with the windows closed. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, watching the cabin. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the woods. In the morning, he was gone. His house was dark, the grass overgrown, the smell faint but still there, seeping from the walls. I haven't seen him since, but some nights, when the air is still and the woods are quiet, that smell drifts back in, curling under the door, filling the hallway, and every time it does, I find a single muddy footprint on the porch, pointed toward the trees like it's waiting for me to follow. Story 6. The ladder in my yard. I woke before sunrise to the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only thing alive for miles. My room was still dim, the air cool from the open window. I rolled over and saw it. A wooden ladder leaning against the side of my house, its top rung level with my bedroom window. It was old, grey, in the way wood gets after years in the weather, and the grain was split in places. I sat up, staring at it, trying to work out if I'd left something leaning there without thinking, but I didn't even own a ladder that tall. I went outside in my bare feet, the grass damp under me, and stood at the base of it. The sides were worn smooth where countless hands must have gripped them, and the rungs had the faint slick feel of wood that had been damp and dried too many times. My nearest neighbor lived a couple 100 yards down the road, a man named Dalton who kept to himself. I walked to his place, ladder still leaning where I'd found it, and knocked on his door. When he opened it, he looked like I'd woken him from a long, heavy sleep. His eyes narrowed when I asked if the ladder was his. He shook his head once, slowly, and said, "Ain't mine." That was all. No questions, no interest, just a flat denial. I went back home, took the ladder down, and laid it in the grass by the shed, figuring I'd deal with it later. By midday, it was gone. I hadn't heard anyone come for it, and there weren't any fresh tracks in the dirt around the shed. That night, I kept my window shut. Still, around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that set every muscle in my body tense. Faint tapping on the glass above my bed. Not the scattered patter of a branch in the wind, but slow, deliberate taps. Space just far enough apart to feel intentional. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The tapping went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I didn't look right away. I waited until the first grey light of morning before pushing the curtain aside. Muddy handprints smeared across the glass, each one large enough to span most of the pane. The streaks looked fresh, the mud still damp in places. My stomach tightened as I saw movement in the yard. Dalton was standing there in the wet grass, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on my window. He didn't wave or call out, just stared for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward his property without a word. The rest of that day passed in a kind of fog. I didn't go to town, didn't speak to anyone. Every time I thought about going down to ask Dalton what he'd been doing, the image of those muddy prints came back to me, and I stayed put. That night, I made sure every window was locked. 2 nights later, I woke to a different sound, a dull thud like wood being set against the side of the house. I lay there in the dark, my breathing shallow, until I heard the faint creak of weight rungs. My mouth went dry. I reached for the lamp, but stopped myself, afraid of drawing attention to the fact that I was awake. The sound stopped about halfway up. Then came the tapping again, slower this time, each tap followed by a faint scrape. I stayed frozen, listening until my heartbeat drowned out everything else. When the silence finally returned, it was heavier than before, pressing against the walls. In the morning, the ladder was back, propped against the same spot. The rungs had fresh mud on them, and the top one had a smear of something darker, almost black. I didn't touch it, I just stood there, staring until I realized I could see faint marks in the grass leading away from the base. They went toward the trees, not toward Dalton's. That day, I kept catching myself looking out the window toward his place. He didn't come outside once. By evening, I decided to take the ladder down and haul it to the edge of the property. I left it leaning against an old fence post in plain view of the road, figuring whoever wanted it could take it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small sounds outside, shifts in the grass, the faint pop of cooling wood. Just before dawn, I heard the creak again, as if the ladder were being lifted from the ground. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. When I went outside, the ladder was gone. A week passed without it returning. I started to think maybe it was over. Then one morning, I woke to see it again. Not against my house this time, but lying flat in the yard, directly beneath my bedroom window. The rungs were slick with dew, but the wood at the top was dry, as if it had been sheltered until just before I'd seen it. I thought about burning it. I even brought it to the fire pit, but something about the feel of the wood under my hands made me set it down again. It wasn't just old, it felt worn in a way that carried the memory of use, as if whatever had climbed it before still lingered there in some way. That night, I dreamed I was climbing it myself. The rungs were cold and slick, and the higher I went, the more the air thinned until I could barely breathe. When I reached the top, there was nothing, just an open window into a room I didn't recognize. Dark and silent. I woke up with my hands aching, my palms sore, like I'd been gripping something too tightly. I haven't seen Dalton since the morning he stood in my yard. His house is dark most nights, though sometimes I'll catch a faint light in an upstairs window, the kind that flickers like a candle. The ladder still shows up now and then, always near the house, always leaning just close enough that I could climb if I wanted to. I never move it anymore. I just wait for it to be gone in the morning. And every so often I'll wake to that sound again, soft tapping on the glass above my bed, steady and patient, like it knows I'm listening. Story 7. The Jar on the Fence Post. It was late summer when I noticed it, The kind of day where the air hangs heavy and the woods feel close. I'd been walking the fence line, checking for damage after a night of hard wind, when I saw it. A glass jar, squat and cloudy, set dead center on the old fence post that marked the line between my land and my neighbor's. Inside was something pale, curled in on itself, the texture halfway between dried fruit and skin. It was too small to be an animal, and too wrong in shape to be any root I'd seen pulled from the ground. The lid was rusted shut, the glass thick, like the kind you'd find in a canning cellar 40 years ago. My neighbor, Ruth, lived alone in the weather-beaten house at the bottom of the hill. She was a small, wiry woman with a voice rough from years of cigarettes and winters that never seemed to let up. When I asked her about the jar, she didn't hesitate. "For keeping the voices quiet," she said, as if that explained everything. Her eyes didn't leave mine when she added, "Don't move it." I nodded like I understood, but her words stuck with me the rest of the day. That night, after the heat faded and the trees turned to silhouettes against the sky, I walked out to the fence with a flashlight. The jar was still there, the pale thing inside pressed against the glass in a way that made my stomach turn. I told myself it was nothing, just some old mountain superstition, and I tipped it over. It rolled once in the dirt before coming to rest against the base of the post. I didn't bother to pick it back up. By morning, it was gone. The post was bare, and the ground around it looked undisturbed, no sign of someone walking up to take it. When I turned back toward the cabin, I froze. Every tree in the clearing wore the same marks, long, deep scratches cut into the bark, fresh enough that the pale wood beneath still glistened. They circled the clearing, each trunk scored at shoulder height, as if something had walked the perimeter in the dark, dragging claws or nails through the wood. That night, I lay in bed listening to the usual chorus of frogs and night insects fade into a stillness that felt unnatural. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind in the leaves, but the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too deliberate. They weren't loud, just the faint hiss of words I couldn't quite catch, slipping through the cracks in the walls. Boone, my dog, lifted his head and stared at the corner of the room, his ears flattening. The sound went on until just before dawn. The next day, I went down to Ruth's. She opened the door only part way, her eyes narrowed. Before I could say a word, she asked, "You moved it, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but my silence must have been enough. She stepped outside, looking toward the tree line, then back at me. "You'd best not be sleeping with your window open," she said, and went back inside, shutting the door behind her. That night, the whispers came earlier, rising and falling like they were passing just outside the walls, circling the cabin. Once or twice, I thought I heard my own name threaded through them. I lit the lamp and kept it burning until the first light of morning. Over the next week, the scratches on the trees deepened, spreading higher up the trunks, as though whatever made them was growing bolder. I started finding small clumps of dirt on the porch, damp as if they'd been pulled from deep underground. Boone refused to go outside after dark, and more than once I caught him staring at the windows, his hackles raised. One night, I stepped out onto the porch just before sunset and found the jar sitting on the top step. The pale thing inside had shifted, pressing hard against the glass. Its surface crinkled like old paper. The lid looked newer now, shiny and tight, and the glass was spotless. I didn't touch it. I left it there, and by morning, it was gone again. The whispers haven't stopped. Some nights they're so faint I can almost pretend they're not there. Other nights they're close enough that I can feel the words moving the air against my skin. I've stopped going to the fence line. I've stopped asking Ruth questions. But the scratches keep appearing, and the trees at the edge of the clearing look thinner now, like something's wearing them down. I don't know if the jar was keeping something out, or keeping it in. All I know is that I moved it, and now it's somewhere else, and whatever it was meant to hold quiet has learned where I sleep. Story 8. The Shed with No Door. When I first moved out here, I noticed the shed right away. It sat on my neighbor Hank's property, down the slope and just past the old fence line. The thing was built from weathered planks that had gone silver grey with age, its roof sagging a little toward the middle. The strangest part wasn't the state of it though, it was that there was no door. Just 4 solid walls and a roof. No opening anywhere I could see, no hinges, no latch, not even a gap wide enough to slip a crowbar into. From where my place sat higher on the hill, I could look straight down at it, and in all the years I lived there, I never saw Hank so much as walk near it. Once, after a few too many beers, I asked him about it. He just stared at me for a long moment, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat, before finally saying, "Better that way." Then he turned back to his woodpile and kept splitting logs like I hadn't spoken at all. I didn't press him. Out here, people guard their business close, and I'd learned enough to know when to leave well enough alone. Months went by. I stopped noticing the shed most days, though I'd catch myself glancing down toward it in the evenings when the light got low. It had a way of looking different at dusk, like the boards were holding a deeper kind of shadow than the rest of the trees around it. It was in late October, on a night when the wind was restless in the trees, that I first heard it. I was sitting by the stove reading when a dull, steady thud drifted through the air. At first I thought it was a branch banging against the side of the cabin, but it wasn't coming from my house. It was coming from down the slope. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my face, and listened. The sound was coming from the shed, slow, steady, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat you could feel in your bones. The wind carried it in bursts, 3 or 4 thuds, then silence, then 3 more. I stood there longer than I meant to, gripping the porch rail, until the sound stopped. When I looked back down the hill, the shed seemed darker than the trees around it, its shape almost humming against the night. The next morning I woke early. Out of habit, I glanced toward the shed and froze. It was gone. The ground where it had stood was bare. The grass inside a perfect square turned brown and brittle, as if it had been dead for years. No planks, no debris, no sign anything had ever been there. I walked down to look. The square was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, the edges sharp and clean. The dirt beneath the dead grass was packed hard, and though the ground had been wet from the rain 2 days earlier, there wasn't a single footprint. Not mine, not anyone's. The air above it smelled faintly of something sour and metallic, a smell I couldn't place but that stayed in my nose for hours after I left. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the eaves and moaning through the trees. I was halfway between waking and sleeping when I heard it. The same slow, steady pounding, but closer this time. I sat up, heart thudding, and realized it was coming from above me, my attic. The sound was muffled, like fists or something heavier hitting the floorboards from the inside. 3 thuds, then a pause. 3 more. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Eventually the sound stopped, and I lay awake until morning, listening for it to start again. The next day, I pulled down the attic ladder. The air that came down with it was cold and dry, carrying a faint trace of that same metallic smell I'd noticed in the dead square of grass. The attic was empty, just dusty boards. A few old boxes left by whoever owned the cabin before me, and a single beam of light coming through a knot hole in the roof. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. 2 nights later, the pounding started again. This time, it was louder, shaking dust from the ceiling onto my bed. Boone, my dog, bolted from the room and wouldn't come back in no matter how much I called him. I tried shouting, telling whoever or whatever It was to get out, but the pounding only grew heavier, faster. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, the attic ladder was already down, though I hadn't touched it since the day I'd checked. I climbed up slowly, every step creaking under my weight. The dust looked undisturbed, except for a single square of the floorboards in the far corner, clean of dust, the wood looking newer, almost wet. It was the exact size and shape of the footprint the shed had left behind in Hank's yard. I never saw the shed again. Hank stopped speaking to me altogether, though I'd catch him watching my place from the edge of his property, his face unreadable. The pounding still comes, not every night, but often enough that I've stopped pretending it isn't real. Always 3 thuds, a pause, then 3 more, like something that isn't in a hurry, something that knows it has time. And every time it starts, I can smell the faint tang of metal in the air, and I think about that perfect square of dead grass and the way Hank's eyes looked when he said it was better that way. Story 9. The Visit After Midnight. It was just after midnight when the knocking woke me. 3 slow raps, deliberate, with enough space between each that I could feel my heartbeat pick up before the next one landed. I lay there for a moment, listening. No wind, no rain, no other sounds. Whoever was at the door wasn't in any kind of hurry. I got up, pulled on a shirt and stepped into the front room. The porch light was out, but through the window beside the door I could see a figure, small, hunched slightly forward, hands clasped around something. When I opened the door, my neighbor stood there. Her name was Clara, though I can't say I knew much more than that. She lived alone in the small house down the road, the one half hidden behind a stand of black locust trees. We'd spoken maybe twice in the 3 years I'd been here, and even then it was just about the weather or the way the power liked to go out in storms. Tonight, her face was pale, eyes fixed on something over my shoulder like she didn't want to meet my gaze. "You'll keep this for me," she said, her voice low and rough, as if she'd been talking or crying for hours. Before I could ask her what she meant, she pushed a bundle into my arms. It was wrapped in an old quilt, the kind that had been mended too many times to count. The fabric was warm, almost uncomfortably so, and heavier than I expected. "What is it?" I asked, but she was already turning, her steps steady but quick. She didn't look back, just walked off into the dark in the direction of her place. The road seemed to swallow her whole, and in a few moments she was gone. I stood in the doorway for a long minute, the weight of the bundle pulling at my arms. Inside, I set it down on the kitchen table. I should have unwrapped it, but something about the way she'd said those words made me feel like I'd agreed to something without knowing it. Instead, I left it there and went back to bed, telling myself I'd check it in the morning. When the sun came up, I went straight to the kitchen. The bundle was still there, just as I'd left it. I hesitated again, my fingers brushing over the worn patches of the quilt. Then I decided I ought to at least tell her I had it. I walked down to her place, cutting through the edge of the field to get there faster. Her house looked different in daylight. The locust trees cast long shadows across the yard, but it wasn't just that. There was something wrong. The front door was shut tight, the curtains drawn, and the place had a stillness to it, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. I knocked anyway. No answer. I went around back, but there was nothing. No car in the drive, no clothes on the line, not even the little wind chimes I remembered hanging by her porch. In town, later that day, I asked a couple of folks about her. Most of them gave me blank looks. A few shook their heads and said no one had lived in that house for years, not since old Mrs. Hensley passed away. I tried explaining that I'd spoken to her, that she'd been at my door just last night, but they only looked at me like I'd lost my mind. That night, I left the bundle where it was. I told myself I'd drive it into town the next day, find someone who might know what to do with it. But I didn't sleep much. Just after midnight, I heard it again. 3 slow raps on the door. The same weight between each one, the same measured rhythm. My chest tightened. I didn't move. The knocks came once more, then stopped. I stayed in bed until dawn. When I finally went to the door, there was nothing outside but the empty road and the soft rustle of leaves. The bundle is still on my kitchen table. I've never unwrapped it. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear a faint sound from inside, like a slow shift of weight or the creak of fabric under strain. And always, around midnight, comes the knocking. I don't open the door anymore, but the rhythm has found its way into my dreams, and sometimes I wake to find myself standing in the kitchen, one hand reaching toward that quilt.